Welcome back. My name is Brian. In today's video we're going to be talking about reading grain direction. To talk about reading grain direction, we're going to start with the log to talk about why we need to read grain direction. If we take a look at our log, we can see a couple things. First, in the center we see the pith, and then we see growth rings that go around our pith. The thing that we're interested in is how do we make lumber out of this? So when we make lumber out of this, the sawmill will cut this board out of here like this, and when they plane saw it, this will leave behind grain that is not perfectly parallel with the length of our cut. This means our grain will have an orientation or a direction to it. For plane sawn lumber, this means that our grain direction does not run parallel to the length of our board. Instead, it is at an angle that we have to deal with. When discussing grain, we can often talk about three types of grain. The first one would be face grain. So this is on the face of the board or the long length of the board. Another one is the end grain, or this is the edge or the end of our board. And finally, there's edge grain, which is the side of our board. And so these three types of grain are all important to our discussion of how to read the grain. We mentioned earlier that our fibers have an orientation. So if our fibers are all slanted facing forward, as you see, what we would want to do is we'd want to plane in this direction. This puts our fibers in tension, and by contrast, if we were to plane in that direction, we start to put our fibers in compression, and we're going to start to get tear out by pushing these fibers back like that. This is a good example of the problem you're trying to avoid. Here you can see tear out along the face grain of this board, and what we'd like to do is avoid that by choosing the grain direction or planing direction to be aligned with the grain direction. Because nature will throw you all kinds of options, I wanted to start with a simple case. So this is a rather obvious case. So here you can see the grain direction is going up and to the right, and what we want to do is we want to plane with that grain direction to avoid tear out, whereas if we came back this way we're likely to get tear out. So we'll demonstrate. Here you can see we're not getting any tear out. We're next going to plane the face of this board, and one of the points I want to make is that in order to choose my planing direction, I need to look at the other two edges, or at least one of the two. So for instance, I can look at the edge here and see that the grain direction goes from the bottom here and sweeps up in that direction towards the top. That means my planing direction should be this way. Well, I could also use this edge in some cases. In this particular case, it's rather obvious that the direction I should be going is up and to the right. Nice and smooth. There's no tear out. I wanted to show you another example that's also relatively common, and that is that here we see the long grain on our face of our board, and we're trying to figure out which direction to plane. And so what we would do is we'd look at both the sides, which you can see the edge grain is flowing up in this direction. Let's first look at the edge grain. So if you look at the edge grain, we can see that it's pointing in that direction, telling us to plane in that direction. If we also look at the end grain, then we can see that this is a smile up or cupped upward. I've heard some people call that a smile. And that tells us to go in the direction of our crown, or the point that was on the face of the board. Going back to the face of our board, our grain or our crown is pointing in this direction. Since this is cupped upward, or we have an upward facing smile instead of a downward facing frown, that tells us to plane in this direction. That aligns with what we see on the side as well. So we can use all that information from the edge and end grain to tell us which direction to plane on the face of our board. Here's another example to where our crown is pointing in this direction, and then when we look at our end grain, it is a smiling face, so we're wanting to go in that direction. And if we look at our edge grain, we see that it is also telling us to go in that same direction. It's pointing up at that angle. So if we put our board like this and give it a try, I'm getting some nice clean shavings. I could keep going, but I want to show you the opposite side of the board, because what happens is we end up playing in the reverse direction. So if we look at the back side of this board, our crown is going in that direction, but when we look at the edge of our board, or end grain, we see that we have a frown, so that's telling us to go in the opposite direction of our crown. If we look at our edge grain, then we also see that that's telling us to also go in the opposite direction of our crown. So we'll give this a try and see how it works. And here we're getting nice shavings with no tear out. Let's look at another case. Here you can see that we have a crown going in the direction of my pen, and we also see that this is a frown down. So what this is telling us is that we should plane in that direction, or along the end that I have pointed here. And so we're going to plane in that direction. If we look at our end grain, it's also telling us that we should do the same. It's pointed up in that direction. And furthermore, what I wanted you to see in this case is that we don't have the full width of this board. We have just a half a section. So here you can see the growth rings in our end grain. What I would like to think about in a board like this is that I should also consider, since the fibers are pointing up in this direction, what I would like to do is I would like to also skew my plane so that the blade comes in at an angle and not at 90 degrees. So instead of having our plane at 90 degrees, we're going to skew our plane at an angle here. And the angle we're going to choose, we're going to want to skew it in the direction of our end grain. So the end grain goes from here over in this direction, and so we're going to skew our plane in that direction. This will help prevent tear out and also leaves behind a really nice surface. So now we save our most difficult case for last. This is where we have some swirling grain or some burl on a piece of walnut. This is often difficult to choose a direction to hand plane. Another thing you can do, instead of just using a bench plane that is embedded at, say, a 45 or 50 degree angle, we can choose a different kind of plane. For instance, we might choose a cabinet scraper to plane the face of this board. Alternatively, we might use a scraping plane. If we compare the angle on these three tools, we can really see the difference between them. Here you can see the bench plane is embedded at about a 45 to 50 degree angle on the frog of the plane, whereas the angle of the embedding for our scraping plane and our cabinet scraper are very different. You can see the blade is leaning much more forward, and these tools, the cabinet scraper and the scraping plane, are ideally made for highly figured material to prevent tear out. If we focus entirely on our edge grain here, you can see the picture's kind of convoluted. It's coming up in this direction here, but if we go onto the opposite side of the board, you can see that it's telling us to plane in that direction. And this is one of those fun tricks that nature throws at you to make sure you're on your toes. In this case, we're going to have to try some different things. We could plane in one direction over a portion of the board and then reverse direction for the other portion. We could also use our scraper plane, and here you can see even the grain direction is coming up in that direction as well. So here we have mixed information, and it's not obvious which direction we should plane. So in a case like this, you should give it a try and see what happens and learn from it. Did a pretty good job. If any of this sounds difficult or complicated, that's because it is. And this is something that woodworkers struggle with and they get better at over time. In most of today's video, we talked about using a hand plane and going with the grain, or learning to read the grain. But this also applies to using a chisel. So in using a chisel, you also want to go with the grain to prevent tear out and breakage. You can apply this concept to many different types of tools that you use in your woodworking, and you can create fun creations like my friend Steve here. Thank you for watching today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope my friend Steve here will see you in a video real soon.